Good morning to everyone here in Manchester, and good morning to everyone joining us at home or via your office via the live web stream for this morning's first session, which is an interview with Lesley Titcomb, who's the new Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator. Now, this isn't Lesley's first interview this morning. I woke up to turn on the telly to see you on BBC Breakfast at 7 o'clock this morning, so audience isn't as large but just as discerning, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Lesley joined the regulator at a time of significant upheaval and challenge for the industry. That was in March this year, and it was a month before the pension freedoms. The biggest changes to pensions in nearly a century were about to launch. Not only that, automatic enrolment was cranking up and getting to the business end, with millions of small and micro employers about to stage over the next couple of years. Not only that, but pension scams, as we know, continue to be a worry and a headache for the industry, and DB funding remains highly stressed. Now, if that wasn't enough to have in the in tray when you start a new job, the Chancellor has thrown into the mix the prospect of even more radical change for the industry to tax relief. All in all, quite a challenging and exciting time to be taking on the job of a regulator. We'll find out Lesley's thoughts in just a few moments. Towards the end of today's session, you'll get an opportunity to put questions to Lesley, that is here in Manchester, and also via the live web stream. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions for her. And if you're tweeting today, do use the hashtag NAPFannual. Good morning, Lesley, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jo.
We've had an early start.
Yes.
So you came into the job at quite a challenging moment. So what were your key priorities?
Well, my number one key priority in the organisation is auto-enrolment. Over the next 2 years, we have to work through ensuring that 1.8 million small and what we call micro employers, very often people who employ just one person, have done what they need to do, which is either to choose a scheme for their employees and enrol them in it, or to tell us that they have no employees who are eligible to be enrolled. So it's a big task. It's a big, high-volume processing task, and we're recognising we're stepping into a different campaign now. It's a step change. We have to talk to this group of employers in a very different way to the large and medium employers.
How are you going to reach out to those mums and dads
absolutely.
with nannies and carers?
Yeah. So within the next few days, we will be launching new web pages which provide a step-by-step journey to help people through this process. Very much simpler, more graphics, that type of thing, and a directed journey for people to follow. And obviously we continue to work with the DWP on campaigns to raise awareness of the need for employers to act in this space.
Okay, we'll return to automatic enrolment in a moment.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just quite interested, now you're nearly 6 months into the job, what your thoughts are about the focus of the regulator.
Well, it's, as I said, clearly focused on very much a ring-fenced part of our business, separately funded, that type of thing. The other aspects are interesting. We've obviously got DB and DC, which everybody's familiar with, but we've also recently taken on responsibilities for the public sector schemes, for the administration and governance there. So that's very much a new part of our business. We're based in Brighton, for people who don't know. We're about nearly 500 people based in Brighton, and a great team of people. Traditionally, very focused on DB, a great level of knowledge on DB, and the interesting challenge for the organisation is as the DC market grows, and we've now got the situation where DC active members in pension schemes have overtaken DB in number terms, it requires a different style of regulation, more front foot, more agile, more preventative, and this takes us into the space of scams and so on. You know, if you want to prevent scams, you've got to act fast. You can't act after the event, the money's gone, it's gone offshore, whatever.
Do you think DB funding is under control?
No, well, not out of control, but equally well, it remains, as you put it, stressed, a challenge.
Yeah, it's an interesting set of objectives you have with DB still being stressed and automatic enrolment to juggle at the same time. Yeah. One of your key objectives is to ensure good member outcomes, but now we're in a space where a pension scheme doesn't have to deliver a pension anymore. So in this world, what does a good member outcome look like?
I think that's a really good question, and I think I think it's starting to mean for people is it isn't just about the savings element, the accumulation anymore. It's also about the decumulation. So are people in a position to make good choices and have good options available to them throughout the process? I also think good member outcomes from our regulatory perspective is that people know that the assets that underpin their pension are secure, that they're going to get the benefits that they're entitled to, and that they're able to access good information about their savings, and particularly their savings in the workplace, and what that's going to mean for them in later life.
We've seen that the workplace has been a lot slower to adapt to the flexibilities than perhaps contract-based schemes. In your view, are they justified in being cautious?
Well, I think that what we have to recognise is that trustees will be looking at the interest of all the members of their schemes, and they'll be thinking about the particular nature of the scheme entrusted to them, the demographics, all that kind of thing. They'll also be thinking about, are we administratively in a position to provide all the options? And many of them are not. What we see is that the larger schemes tend to be providing the full range of decumulation options now available. The smaller schemes not offering necessarily that full range. A quarter of them tell us that they will consider adding in additional options later on. They may be reflecting the fact they've got a younger workforce who are nowhere near 55 yet or whatever. But there's always this backup that the member can ask to transfer out to a scheme or to a provider which does provide the options, and that is happening.
Right. The new landscape, however, is creating lots of challenges for employers and sponsors just to get their heads around what risk looks like now. So can you sort of give any guidance in terms of red lines that they shouldn't cross?
Well, I mean, what I would say is we know that something that concerns trustees is the issue of the boundary where regulated advice begins, and many of them are concerned about stepping over that boundary, and obviously I wouldn't want them to do that, but I recognise that they have a concern and that may be constraining them in what they can do. So that's something, you know, we're looking at with the FCA, and the FCA and the Treasury are about to commence their review of advice anyway. But I'm, you know, what I would say is in all the pension stuff, it's particularly true, say, in DB funding, the earlier you start a good conversation between the employer and the trustees, the more likely you are to come to a good mutual agreement. And that applies across the piece. The other thing I would say on the that we're learning, for example, from the trustee survey that we've done this summer, is that some schemes are very, very good at challenging their advisors, doing things like renewing their advisors every so often, having a regular beauty parade and considering reappointment, but then challenging their advisors once they're in post, not just letting it drift on for 5-6 years or whatever. So I would say to schemes and to trustees in particular, get the training and challenge your advisors.
Mm-hmm. Are you still convinced that DB to DC transfers are unlikely to be in the members' best interests?
Well, in pure monetary terms, the fact, you know, remains that in many cases, because of the level of the employer's contribution or all that kind of thing, it is still likely that many people will benefit from staying in DB if it's still available, but we know increasingly it's not. And we have to face the fact that, as the freedoms and choice show us, there are justifiable circumstances when people want to access their savings. And so, you know, it depends how you measure what interest is. What the consumer's interest is. If it's pure how much money you're going to accumulate, then it may be best to stay with the DB.
It seems like there's been a bit of a shift in your attitude.
But I think, you know, there's been a shift in the whole concept of pension saving here, and the emphasis that it is the members' money, and in the end they will have choices, certainly when they reach 55, about what they do with that money.
It's all right to have that choice, but there is also safeguards which have been put in place to ensure that people don't trip up. And you were at one of the sessions yesterday where we sat on stage and heard of stories of two consumers who recently made the most of the pension freedoms with small pension pots and got tripped up badly with unexpected tax bills and sent off for advice which they didn't even know they needed, etc. Now you're looking into paralleling the FCA's retirement risk warnings, currently making them a bit more individualised. What are your thoughts on the cap that the FCA is considering putting on that at £10,000, and anything below that doesn't get a personalised risk warning?
I think any sort of cap is always going to be problematic, and we saw the lady yesterday,
yes,
you know,
who'd
ended
had a
up,
small pension
yeah,
pot,
small pension pot, 32k, and she'd ended up paying having to pay 600k for advice, and she argued that she knew what she wanted to do, and that therefore the advice was of limited value to her. Now, you know, so what level do you set the cap? There are going to be problems, whatever. I think the really other interesting point that came out of yesterday for me, though, was the other lady, and the lack of awareness about the tax position, yes, and the impact on her tax credits.
She had £10,000. She had a £5,000 withdrawal.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
right.
And I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. And so, you know, is there enough focus in what people are saying to people who are thinking about exercising the options about the tax position?
So you recognise there are certain weaknesses in
and we know that from talking to TPAS and so on, when the freedoms were first launched, the biggest eye-opener for people when they were talking to TPAS and so on was about tax, and an awful lot of people had not realised the tax implications, for example, of taking their whole pot.
Mm-hmm. Just moving on back to automatic enrolment. Up until now, your approach has been to use the carrot and cajole approach. Educate, let me get this right.
Educate, enable, enforce.
Back to front. Which works quite well with the bigger firms, and it's an easier message to communicate. But now you're moving into a world which is going to expand quite exponentially. Should we be seeing more stick?
Well, we have sticks if we have to use them. But I genuinely believe educate, enable, enforce will still work. I'm a small firms regulator by background when I was at the FCA. And the one thing I know from 20 plus years in regulation is the vast majority of people want to do the right thing. They may not always be able to, and in the case of many of these smaller businesses in particular, there's often a time factor. So it means that for us, the challenge is to make it as simple as possible for them and as quick as possible for them to do what they need to do, and that way they will get over the line. Some of them we will have to nudge, the occasional few I dare say we will have to kick, and a few we will have to fine. But, you know, if we're fining them, it's usually because they just have a fundamental problem with the concept of auto-enrolment rather than doing something wrong or not. We can get them over the line if they're willing to move. What
are you doing to help employers find good schemes?
Well, the first thing we do, what we know from our research is that the challenge really big challenge for employers in all this is choosing a scheme. Now, obviously, as we get to the small and micro end of things, this is what Nest was set up to deal with. It has the public service obligation, so Nest is the scheme that has to take everybody that comes to it. And so that's an important part of the machinery. We've also introduced the list of schemes available for auto-enrolment which have master trust assurance, a short list at the moment, but I hope it will grow.
It's only 3 at the moment. It's been in there for a year though, hasn't it? So are you disappointed that more schemes?
To be quite frank, I am, and I would strongly urge
Nest hasn't even got master trust.
I know Nest is focusing on it very strongly.
Do you think it's time to make that assurance framework
Well, it's compulsory? An interesting question, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the things that we could look at or ask the government to look at, is to make master trust assurance compulsory for if you're going to be open for AE. I do think we have to look at the issue of master trusts and the regulatory regime that applies to them. They are fulfilling a hugely important role in auto-enrolment, particularly as we get into this small and micro world.
What are your concerns about the market as it's developing in the pace?
Well, as you say, it's a fast-growing market. It's a relatively easy market to enter. So in order to set up a master trust scheme, the hurdle you have is HMRC registration, and the HMRC registration is about your fitness and properness to run a scheme, but with the particular focus on the calculation of the tax relief. But given my objectives, of course, I have a rather different set of interests in what those master trusts are doing. Are they going to be able to look after the customer's assets, administer it well, be a well-governed scheme? Are they able, should they not succeed in business for any reason, to be able to wind themselves up in an orderly fashion? That type of thing.
sound like big concerns. And how urgent do you think the government or this issue needs addressing?
Well, we are talking to the government about it and looking at it. You know, we have identified it as a gap, and we feel there's a spectrum of things that could be done to address it.
Do you have any current concerns about master trusts, in particular master trusts in the market?
No, and if you look at our survey of trustees and what we learned also from the survey on freedom and choice, you know, the master trusts are there. They're offering a good range of options and generally a good service to people. We have got additional regulation for them in many ways already, with things like the requirement for chair statements and so on coming in. But the thing that does concern me perhaps is the sustainability issue,
which is
in a highly competitive market.
Yes. Just explain what that issue might mean for a
member. My concern is, you know, there's no financial requirement on master trust to set solvency, for example, or, you know, a minimum level of capital. And so if they do go out of business, it could be quite messy.
Right.
And, you know, I want to know that if anything happens, we can work with them to deal with it in orderly fashion, to transfer the people who are affected to other schemes and so on, and to help the employers who'll be affected by it too.
So in terms of your concerns about the market, would that be sort of near top?
Yeah, that's one of my current, probably biggest concerns in the auto-enrolment space.
And what are your other concerns?
Oh, they vary from day to day. You know, that's the interesting thing about being at the regulator. No 2 days are the same.
Can I just talk to you about the types of schemes that people are being enrolled into, in particular net pay arrangements? Now, net pay, there isn't a facility or mechanism in net pay for low earners and people who don't pay tax to get that, you know, get what they're entitled to, which is that tax relief from the government. And should those schemes be promoting themselves in the automatic enrolment space?
Well, the fact is those schemes are complying with the law. The law allows both types of... there has been this particular issue develop, particularly because of the difference between the auto-enrolment trigger level and the tax banding. So we understand that it's a relatively small number of people who are affected by it at the moment in terms of a relatively small amount of money. And I know that the Minister for Pensions has also picked up on this. And it is a challenge, and, you know, it would be a challenge if that gap were to widen in any way. But the fact is the schemes are operating within the law at the moment. So I think the way that we have to look at this is through the tax regime and the tax law. The government are reviewing tax relief at the moment, and that may provide an opportunity to look at this.
Do you consider the disclosure to be robust enough for employees looking for schemes to be made aware that they're enrolling staff into schemes which will disadvantage lower earning members of their workforce?
You've hit the nail on the head there. Employees should ask and employers should disclose.
They've got no idea. They just expect, because the government is promising them tax relief, and the regulator too.
So we need to look at what the employers are actually saying, the information, that type of thing. Is it being made clear? But that's my message to employers, is make it clear to your employees.
How are they supposed to do that? Through letters, or to tell them?
Well, it will have to be through information. As I genuinely hope some employees will pick up on it and ask further questions. But, you know, it would be interesting, I think, for us to have a look at how employers are doing this.
Okay. Just moving on to DB, into defined benefit, the PPF index has shown that the funding positions of UK schemes have worsened by 450 billion since 2008. Do you consider the current regime to have worked, or do you think other changes are needed?
It's very interesting. I think this is going to be one of the biggest areas of discussion between ourselves and the industry and the government over the next year or so, which is, how is the DB situation going to play out? You've absolutely highlighted the situation at the moment, and Steph Flanders yesterday was talking about the volatility in the market and all that kind of thing, and how that can impact day to day on the valuations and so on. What I think we have to look at is, how do we feel this is going to play out? What are the impact of all this potentially on the PPF? Do we, as the regulator, have the right objectives as we get into the later maturing years of DB schemes? I mean, these schemes they pay out at a maximum level in 2026, and then it starts to decline thereafter. So Other challenges for us, we're going to have increasingly disengaged employers sponsoring those schemes. The senior management of a firm probably won't be in the DB scheme, and they'll be asking, why the hell are we paying X million pounds a year to keep this scheme going for a load of deferred pensioners who don't work for us anymore?
So they're becoming more disengaged, and you identify that as the future
yeah.
is.
So what does that mean for the trustees of those schemes, and what we're asking of them? And then what we have seen is that, of course, with our approach, particularly with the new objective, I think the quality of discussions between the employers and the trustees is improving. More flexibility in the design of recovery plans, that type of thing. So less focus on the 10-year recovery plan and so on and so forth. But I think there's a lot more to go on this, a lot more to be worked through.
How far are recovery plans stretching out these days?
Well, you know, I've seen them so far ranging from about 8 years to 12 years.
So and are you comfortable
it's starting
with that range,
to,
or?
yeah.
Okay. And what can you say about how the Sustainable Growth Objective is being applied?
Yeah, well, it's been very interesting actually, and I mean, talking to, for example, the employer representatives, they're pretty happy with it. You know, they were very happy that it was introduced and put on the face of the legislation. They believe that we are getting more consistent in our approach to these situations, and in particular to taking account of the position of the employer. But what I would say is, as a regulator, if there is one piece of feedback I have always heard from the regulated community, it's the regulator's not consistent. And then the answer is, but every situation is different. So you do have to strike this balance.
Do you listen to that feedback,
though? I do. And what's really important for us is the training of particularly our case management people.
Right.
So that you have a clear methodology.
Are you confident that there is a consistent approach being applied in these inconsistent situations?
We have done a huge amount of investment in the training of our case managers in this situation to take account particularly of the new objective. Some of the trustees may think we've gone too far. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts. But we do actually need to constantly invest in the training of our case managers, learn from the cases that we go through. It's a bit like being a doctor or a policeman. You know, you think about medical teams and how they review cases after the event. There's lots to learn from these other professions as well.
And how are you going to measure whether this objective has been effective? For example, might you expect to see a material rebalancing of cash back to the sponsors?
At the moment, we're focusing on awareness and actually going out and talking to employers and getting their views through research and so on whether they feel that we are taking more account of the sustainability. Over the longer term, we will be able to look at some numeric measures, I'm sure, but not within a year and a half. It wouldn't be right.
Right. One of the issues that might sort of throw up from that sort of cash issue where it's going is that members might be worried that, you know, why is the directors just putting that money into their back pockets or their salaries? I mean, you're going to expect trustees to demand real evidence that the money, if it is being used for growth, is used for growth.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think we're asking an awful lot of trustees, as I said earlier, and capabilities vary hugely across the piece. But we're asking them to balance, to have discussions with the employer, to come up with solutions and plans and approaches that balance the investment risk, the level of contribution, the range of benefits, all that kind of thing. And yeah, you know, I do think they should be challenging on the financial projections of the employer, the strength of the covenant, and as you say, that if the statement is made that X is being done with this money so it isn't available to go into the scheme, then yeah, challenge that. Is that absolutely what's happening?
Your current approach is risk-based. You've got a lot to supervise, etc. But is there a risk that your focus on the largest schemes might leave members of smaller schemes exposed?
I genuinely don't think so. And as I said, for example, our trustee survey this summer, 800 trustees from the largest schemes to the smallest schemes. And we are particularly focused on what that has told us about the trustees of smaller schemes, who clearly struggled sometimes to find the time to do their role. They're less likely to have taken up training, for example, from our trustee toolkit, that type of thing. they're probably less well positioned to challenge their advisors. So I do think we have to think quite hard about segmenting our trustee population and on the educate and enable side, thinking about targeting much more.
Do you think they're really up to the job? I mean, you should be thinking about something a bit tougher, like consolidation of trustees. There
are all sorts of things you could think of. You know, I think attracting trustees and just getting the number we're going to need is going to be challenging. And I think there's a whole different debate around the proliferation of small schemes and whether consolidation is a good thing or not. But I think from the other angle you could argue about on trustees, for example, is do we want to go where the Dutch and the Irish are going, which is with mandatory T&C qualification, training and competence qualifications for trustees. I think we run the risk of struggling even more to attract good lay trustees if we were to introduce mandatory qualifications for everybody. But, you know, our survey again shows that schemes which are chaired by an independent trustee tend to be better governed and better administered. So is there something to look at there?
Mm-hmm. Moving on to the question that that always comes, and that's about the single regulator.
Oh, yes. Couldn't get through an interview without that one.
You spent your career with the FCA, the majority of your career with the FCA. So where do you stand in relation to a possible merger between the TPR and the FCA?
Well, the standard answer, of course, is that it's not for the regulator to decide, it's a matter for government. And it is. I mean, that's just a fact, and there will be all sorts of things that come into play there. But the way I look at it is, you know, we need to, at the very least, have an excellent working relationship with the FCA and ensure that our regimes are aligned wherever possible and be able to explain why they're different if they're different. And it does tend to be for good reasons, largely the difference between trust and contract law. It's that simple. And I think people would be deluding themselves if they felt that crashing the two regulators together structurally would solve the problem. You'd still be operating under different law, different legislative frameworks, and different regulatory toolkits in terms of the powers that are given in law. So please don't ever think it's just about structurally crashing two things. And that is expensive, and it takes a lot of senior management head time. And to be quite frank, I'd rather concentrate on other things at the moment.
Okay, and just finally, you're the first female to step into the role of pensions regulator at a time when women seem to be taking over pensions positions in the UK. So you've got any specific thoughts on how outcomes for women can be improved?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that has highlighted this is the net pay situation, but also auto-enrolment generally. And we've seen the figures of people who are not covered by auto-enrolment because they perhaps fall below the £10,500 threshold, that type of thing.
Where do you stand on that specifically?
So, you know, I do believe that we all have a public policy need to look at pension provision for women in general terms and to try and improve it. I know the Minister is very committed to looking at, to thinking about that, not surprisingly. But at the regulator, for example, as the first female CEO there, and as a public body, of course, we at the regulator are subject to what's called the public sector equality duty. And we have to think about how we create a diverse and inclusive workforce at the regulator, not just in gender terms, but in terms of all the other strands that are protected under that legislation. But from my perspective, it's not about the law. I want a really good, strong workforce and that's genuine, inclusive, where people feel they have something to bring to the organisation, whatever their background.
Just finally, do you think there is any need for that 10,000k threshold to be reviewed?
Well, I'm always in the view that, you know, there are aspects of pension provision that would need to be looked at. Another aspect is auto-enrolment doesn't cover the self-employed. So, you know, the politicians have to think about what do they want to tackle next.
Okay, I've run up the bottom of my list. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions that the audience have following that interview. So if you've got any questions, if you want to put up your hands now, I can't really see that well from up here. No one want to start? There's one down the back there. And if you could just say your name for me and where you're from, thank you.
Catherine McKenna.